The United States has the world's third largest population with a whopping 340 million people. Unlike a country such as China, that largely incorporates indigenous peoples, the United States has a great degree of diversity. This diversity in the population has come from immense and sustained global immigration. It is probable that no other country has a wider range of racial, ethnic, and cultural types than the United States. Though the country has a great population, that's not necessarily the case with the population density in the region. So, what could be the reason behind it? Well, maybe the country's geography is at fault. Or maybe the country's history and other substantial transformations are to blame for its low population density. But none, however, is as important as the imaginary boundary that separates the eastern and western United States. So what is this unique imaginary boundary that divides the US into two parts? And how does it carve out a strip of land that always gets skipped over by people? This is the story of a unique land that was fought over but never taken. This is the story of why 50% of the US is still empty. This is Geomore. The United States is one of the world's greatest economic powers, and its major characteristic is none other than its great variety of physical environments, alongside great diversity in its population of roughly 340 million. Although the total population of the United States is quite large by world standards, its overall population density is relatively low. The country embraces some of the world's largest urban concentrations, as well as some of the most extensive areas that are almost devoid of habitation. So, what could be the reason behind it? Well, maybe because large wilderness areas are filled with uninhabitable mountains, impassable deserts, and off-limits nature reserves. But it's not just about the geography of the country, but of the history as well. The United States began its existence on the eastern side of the country when the first English settlement arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Motivated by economic opportunities and the desire to claim land in this new territory, a series of colonies emerged from the British Empire, leading to the earlier and easier development of the land. This expansion started on the East Coast, and from there, the United States gradually moved towards the west. In 1803, the country acquired a vast area of land from France, which included much of the modern Midwest region of the country. This purchase allowed the United States to have access to the vast Mississippi River and all of its fresh water. It not only allowed for relatively easy irrigation of agricultural land, but it also allowed for trade and travel by ships. The combination of easy agriculture and easy transportation was a recipe for rapid development. This was followed by the 1849 gold rush to Northern California, which marked the beginning of significant changes. As decades passed, advancements in transportation and livability technologies facilitated the development of major cities. Gradually, the western half of the country began to develop. Cities such as Boise, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and Denver began establishing themselves as population centers throughout the middle of the country. During this period, 11 million people migrated from rural to urban areas. Today, America's top 100 metropolitan areas alone account for at least 3/4 of the nation's GDP. Cities bring people and firms together in relatively close proximity, which in turn drives innovation and leads to positive economic benefits and growth. However, urbanization has led to rural areas experiencing a decline in population and economy, and a shift from traditional ways of life. This demographic divide can be further illustrated by an invisible vertical line that divides the US into two parts. This sharp division between populated and unpopulated America follows a nearly vertical line south to north, immediately to the west of many major population centers like San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Lincoln, Omaha, Sioux Falls, Fargo, and all the way up to Winnipeg in Canada. Approximately 272 million Americans, or 80% of the population, reside east of this line, meaning that the remaining 20%, or roughly 1 in 5 Americans, reside west of the line. An enormous area that, when Alaska is taken into account, actually makes up the majority of America's land. But a vast exception to this general rule is California, which is home to almost 40 million people, or roughly 60% of all Americans living west of the 98th meridian line. Things get even stranger when the majority of Californians reside on the state's westernmost borders, close to the Pacific Ocean. But let's just forget about California for a second and skip over to a part where we draw a separate line from San Diego in the south, across the US West Coast, through Portland and Seattle in the north. We would find that there are around 50 million Americans who live within the narrow coastal plain between the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Cascades and Sierra Nevada mountains to the east. Between the 98th meridian and an isolated, long-lasting pocket of civilizations encircled by darkness, there is a wide expanse of the American interior that is somewhat smaller than the European Union and makes up approximately one-third of all the country's land area. It includes the entirety of 8 US states, as well as a sizable portion of 9 additional states. Although just 30 million people, or around 9% of the US population, live in this enormous area of land. Around one-third of them simply live within just 3 of these oases: Phoenix, Denver, and Las Vegas. More than half of them live within just the top 8 largest oases, including Salt Lake City, Tucson, Albuquerque, El Paso, and Boise. When excluding just these 8 urban oases, the rest that remains throughout the area is home to less than 15 million people. Around the same number of people who live within just LA and Orange counties in Southern California. This immense expanse of land is nearly completely devoid of human habitation and civilization, making it one of the most desolate places on Earth in the 21st century. But the question is, how and why does this invisible linear law of nature that decides so much about American society and civilization exist in the first place? To answer that, we need to go back a few decades to the first man who ever noticed the line's reality. John Wesley Powell served as the second director of the United States Geological Survey, in addition to being a geologist and explorer of the American West. He saw that the variety of plant species steadily decreased to almost non-existent as he traveled from the east to the west. He concluded that this was the case because it simply rained more in the east than in the west, and thus found out about the 100th meridian line of longitude. He drew the line to mark the border between the more wet east and the more arid west, which was roughly correct when we look at a modern map of annual rainfall levels within the United States. John Wesley Powell accurately recognized the huge Rocky Mountains as one of the geographic explanations for this law of nature in North America. With peaks reaching as high as 13,000 and 14,000 feet, these long and towering peaks effectively act like a colossal wall, blocking most of the moisture blowing in on clouds from the Pacific Ocean and preventing most rain from passing beyond them towards the arid plains of the east. This effect is called the rain shadow effect. Across the North American plains, the Rockies cast an enormous shadow because of their substantial size. They span more than the 3,000 miles across the continent, from the northern reaches of British Columbia and Canada all the way down to New Mexico in the south. However, there are a number of other geographic factors that also contribute to North America's straight climate line. For example, the Cascade Mountain Range, which stretches across the Pacific Northwest, clearly divides the region between the wet, narrow coastal plain to the west and the Rocky Mountains, which are not the only mountain ranges on the continent that block moisture blowing in from the Pacific. Being robbed of almost all moisture blowing in from the Pacific Ocean to the west, the continental interior of North America has very few other alternative sources for moisture or fresh water, most of them being limited to rivers or snowmelts on the eastern side of the continent. For comparison, the Appalachians are the largest mountain range, yet they are really only speed bumps compared to the giants of the West. With Mount Mitchell's low elevation of less than 6,700 feet, or less than half the height of the highest peaks in the Rockies, the Cascades, and the Sierra Nevada. very little moisture is blocked from entering the continent from the Atlantic Ocean in the east. As a result, moisture is frequently brought in by Atlantic winds across the eastern Mississippi Basin and the East Coast, allowing large-scale agriculture to flourish without the need for irrigation. But regrettably, these winter Atlantic storms never reach far enough to get to the western plains beyond the 98th and 100th meridian lines of longitude. In the summer, moisture from the Gulf of Mexico will also enter the continent, but these winds usually blow north before turning east, flooding the eastern United States with rain while leaving the west. When all of these variables are taken into account, the end consequence is that there is just less fresh water available throughout this uninhabited one-third of America, which means that there is less water available for cultivation and drinking. The crops that are grown on either side of the line are also frequently very different from one another. To the east of the line, farmers tend to choose thirsty crops like corn, while to the west of the line, where water is significantly more scarce, farmers prefer to grow drought-resistant wheat. And it's not just about the rain shadow that mountains create, but also about the wild temperature fluctuations. These shadowed areas are very cold in the winter and quite hot in the summer. Polar winds ride the mountain chains rapidly down the center of the country in a single day. Imagine a winter day where it's pleasantly warm in the morning, but then drops below zero later in the afternoon. That very thing recently happened in Wyoming, when the temperatures dropped from 6 degrees Celsius to minus 16 degrees Celsius in a half hour. These sudden changes in outside temperature are harmful to human health. Hence, places with extreme temperature fluctuations mostly get skipped over. But the problems don't end with the wild temperature fluctuations or lack of rainfall. Droughts are also contributing to the already widening problem. The western part of the United States is currently experiencing what is perhaps the worst drought the area has had in thousands of years. For almost a century, the Colorado River has supplied fresh water to a large portion of the American Southwest. Nevertheless, this year marks the first time in history that the Colorado River is drying up. The Colorado River provides fresh water to approximately 40 million people throughout the American West, but it has already been so extensively irrigated and extracted that the river no longer reaches its natural delta in the Gulf of California. This marks the first time in American history that the federal government of the United States has cut the water that states are allowed to withdraw from the river, with the potential for additional cuts in the future. Hence, water scarcity will be the defining feature for the 21st century, and it may well get worse still. All of these factors combined have contributed to the underpopulation of this belt. Despite its vast size and unique geography, the region has not seen the same level of development and prosperity as other parts of the country, as there is less incentive for businesses and industries to move to the area, which in turn has made it less attractive for people to settle there. Despite efforts to encourage development in the region, such as the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered free land to settlers who were willing to develop it, lack of resources and lack of infrastructure have made it likely that this area will continue to remain relatively underpopulated in the future. But perhaps most concerning of all is not the underpopulation of the area, but something else. Given how quickly the global climate is changing, it seems the boundary between North America's wet and dry regions is moving eastward. Since Powell's time, when he correctly identified the 100th meridian as the approximate boundary of the line, it has steadily shifted eastward to around the 98th meridian today. It seems that this eastward migration is only going to continue, and this will have a significant impact on the climate of all American frontier communities, from Fargo in the north to San Antonio in the south. As the century goes on, we will all experience progressively less consistent rainfall, with all of the ensuing economic damages that will require an increasing number of farms in this area to adopt irrigation techniques. Many of these farms will be forced to merge with other farms, while most of them will be forced to give up growing thirsty crops like corn and switch to more arid-friendly crops like wheat. Water is becoming more and more difficult to find in the West, and will only get worse. Long before today, in an effort to persuade the US Congress to take drastic measures, Powell drew a line across the 100th meridian, which separated the drier west from the wetter east. But it was of no use. He did warn that due to a severe shortage of fresh water, the American West would need to be settled very differently from the east, with development needing to be more meticulous, precise, and well planned ahead of time. But Powell's scientifically grounded recommendations and cautions were disregarded by Washington politicians. And now, we, the people of the US, are paying the price for that. And it's plausible to say that we are going to pay the price in the coming future as well. But that leaves one question: until when? And that concludes the story of why 1/3 of the US is sparsely populated due to its landscape and other substantial transformations. And guess what? Especially with the invisible line moving towards the east, climate change is going to force the country to see many more of those transformations. It takes a huge amount of research, creativity, and effort to bring these historical and geographical transformations to life. If you found this journey intriguing, then we'd be really grateful if you would show your support with a like and by subscribing to Geomore. Well, that's it from us. Until next time.